If you go back, say, as recently as 4 or 5 years ago, you'll tend to find that in terms of creature capturing RPGs like Pokemon and the like, that PC didn't really have very many of those, and if you wanted that sort of gameplay, generally speaking, that was the domain of consoles, especially handheld consoles. If you wanted to play something like that, there were only really a couple of franchise choices, and most of which were on handhelds or consoles. So a PC user didn't really have much choice in terms of actually playing those sorts of games, which is kind of unfortunate because they're a lot of fun. They're things that a lot of us actually grew up with, so not having an option to play very many things like that on PC was kind of a bummer for a while, but recently we've seen a pretty big resurgence of that genre on PC, with a pretty large number of those games coming out now, either into early access or just as full releases or as things that are about to release soon. So I figured as someone who really enjoys JRPGs and who sort of grew up with a lot of these games and likes the genre a lot, that it's sort of, it'd be a good idea for me to just take a look at them. You know, the least I could do is take a look at some of the newer wave of these games that's actually coming out on PC and see how they are. So the first one I wanted to take a look at is this one that just came out a couple of days ago at the time of recording, Nexomon Extinction. Nexomon was actually a game that was released a few years ago, I believe 2017, I think, on mobile, and it did eventually make its way to Steam, although like a lot of mobile ports, it was sort of only mildly successful because it bore the marks of a mobile port, and was thus sort of avoided by a lot of people, and I can't really blame them. You know, it had a lot of the traditional marks that people look at and generally don't want to touch, like the big ugly UI buttons that are meant for touchscreens, the remnants of microtransactions, that sort of thing, but they decided to actually make a full-on sequel that was meant more for PC and the like, and they did a really good job of it, actually. So Nexomon Extinction is, in fact, a full sequel with a continuation of the story of the original, although you don't have to play the original to actually know what's going on, and it's a creature capturing RPG in a pretty traditional sense. It feels a lot like Pokemon. It has very Pokemon-like types, fairly Pokemon-like story, although with a bit of a sort of post-apocalyptic twist, which is sort of interesting. And it will be familiar to you in terms of its gameplay if you've ever played a creature capturing RPG like that. One of the more immediate differences that I actually liked right off the bat is the way that this game handles starters. Traditionally in this genre, starters are usually given a choice between 3 different creatures to start with. That's usually how it works, and they're usually some of the more beginner-friendly types that you would then choose one of and then, you know, go and grow your team from there. But in this case, you actually get a choice between 9 starters, one for each type, which is really cool. That allows you to actually not have to wait to get a creature of the type that you really like and actually start with one of them, and I appreciate the flexibility that that gives you. It's pretty neat. And of course, since this game does have Ghost type in it, and Ghost type is my favorite, I of course chose the Ghost type starter and named it something really stupid and was very pleased with myself. And from then you will go into the world and into a surprisingly open story. There is a story, and it's actually not a bad one, but you'll tend to find that most of the game world is actually open from the beginning, so despite there being a structured story, you can kind of go just about anywhere you want from the start. Although of course you do have to be careful not to wander into super hard dungeons or anything. That being said, the game does have a sort of level scaling system. It's sort of a relaxed level scaling, by which I mean if you're, say, like level 20 creatures, you won't always find exactly level 20 creatures no matter where you go, but earlier areas that were a lower level will now have bumped up a bit to be like around the 15 to 20 range. So there is always a sort of a sense of progression, you could say. I'm normally not a huge fan of level scaling in RPGs. I think it kind of takes away from the challenge, but in this case, I think the fact that it's sort of a loosely done level scaling, like not everything is always exactly the level that you are every single time. There's a bit more of a leeway there, so you can still bumble into situations where things are a much higher level, or still go to earlier areas and things won't be quite as strong and you can dominate them for a while, is nice. You know, it takes away some of the issues I tend to have with level scaling by doing it in a more loose way that isn't quite so adherent to the exact strength you are at any given time, making nothing feel like a very different challenge. So I do appreciate that, even if it is a system that I usually don't tend to like too much. The story focuses around this guild with, of course, a dark secret, and your place within it as a tamer going through the ranks from bronze to silver to gold to grandmaster, and trying to uncover this secret as well as make sense of the world around you. I did mention a sort of post-apocalyptic theme, and that's because in the first game's ending, everything is basically destroyed. The world is free of the big evil, but it takes a huge toll. So in this game, it is only fairly shortly after that happens, so there's lots of ghosts around and some curses and some destroyed ruins of cities everywhere. It's not exactly the pleasant sack saccharine, bright world that a lot of Pokemon games are known for, which I do appreciate. It is still a very bright, nice, colorful art style, but the world itself does have some weird laboratories and weird dark secrets and things. And that's actually some of the most memorable parts of the Pokemon stories to me, were like when you got into the weird laboratories where things were suddenly kind of dark and strange. So having a game that's more focused on expanding that theme to the whole world is pretty cool. I do appreciate that juxtaposition of like weird, dark biological experiments with this sort of bright, colorful art style. There are also lots and lots of side quests to do, which is always nice when you have a game that's so focused around exploration and allowing you to go to a lot of future areas early if you want to. So although not every side quest is available from the start, you know, as you progress through the story, more stuff will open up, areas will become accessible that weren't before, shops will stock new items, and new side quests will become available, so that it gives you a nice sense of progression. But still, it's nice that you're able to just sort of wander around the world if you want and ignore the main story for a while and find stuff to do still. In addition to the NPCs that will have some side quests for you, you'll also often come across NPCs that want to trade certain things. And they may want certain Nexomon for a specific reward, they may just want some money for something or some elemental shards for something. Pretty much any item or creature in the game is possible to be traded back and forth from these NPCs. So it can be pretty handy because sometimes they offer some things that are very hard to find, or some things that have a very high cost to them but allow you to get them in different ways, like the elemental Nexotraps, for instance. There's a standard Nexotrap that works like a Pokeball. You throw it and it can capture a monster, but there are also elemental ones, one for each type, that gives you a higher chance of capturing that particular type. Familiar if you've ever played a Pokemon game with stuff like the Netball and things like that. You know, there's usually like a Pokeball type for just about each creature. And these can be really hard to find, and if you actually find them for purchase at merchants and things, they tend to be really, really expensive. So coming across NPCs that are offering them for things other than money is really nice, actually, and this works for all sorts of other things in the game. One thing that the game does that I also really like are the stackable key items. These are some of the more common trades that you'll see for like some rare materials and things to allow you to get a hold of them, and you'll also tend to find them in chests sort of off the beaten path and the like. There's a bunch of different key items that give you a percentage boost to something just by having them in your inventory, and they're stackable. So the more of that same item you find, the better their effect is. These can be anything from the greed wallet, which gives you like a 10% boost to the amount of money that encounters drop for every one you find, so that adds up very quickly, to the extremely useful whistles, because the catch rate, the base catch rate for creatures isn't that high, but there is a whistle type for every type of creature, and each one gives you a 3% boost to the catch rate. So as you get more and more of these whistles for each type of creature you can encounter, your natural catch rate goes up. You can also feed creatures to catch them. It enhances your catch rate, and you can find foods that they like a lot that'll enhance it more per feeding. Of course, you have to be careful since they get a free turn after that. And there's also something like a secret sauce, I believe it's called, that gives the food an extra effect, an extra percentage effect as you stack those up. So there are all sorts of other things. Also, there's stuff like the experience boosters, which are very useful, that give you a 3% boost to the gained experience after battles for each one you have. So gathering and finding these key items is a nice reward for exploration and for completing some of the harder trades and things, because it gives you a nice sense of reward. You know, they're pretty useful, and the fact that they stack up that quickly to have very powerful effects after a while means that you do want to find as many of them as you can, especially things like the experience boosters, the catch rate whistles, and the discount vouchers as well that allow you to buy things from all shops cheaper, because some of the things that you'll need, like potions and traps, do get pretty expensive. The combat system is pretty much exactly what you would expect for a game like this. It is a one-on-one turn-based affair with 4 abilities on each creature, and of course the type system where different types are advantageous or disadvantageous to other types, and as you will go through the game you'll learn how each of the types work and all that. It's expected and it does it well. You know, it doesn't pull off any sort of crazy new mechanics or anything that's very different from, say, a Pokemon game, but the mechanics that it does have, it tends to do quite well, and the combat is pretty fun. The particle effects for the attacks are nice. There's a pretty good variety in attacks and a very good variety in creatures, by the way. I think the number is 381 Nexomon that you can catch and evolve, which is pretty great because, you know, a creature catching RPG like this thrives on its variety. The more stuff that you have to find and raise and evolve and breed eventually and all that sort of stuff. You know, you want the most varied team that you can have in games like this. Pretty much everyone plays them differently, so, you know, I like to amass ghost types, for instance. So having that much variety and stuff that you can find and catch is a very good idea, and it's nice that it's only 2 games into this series and you already have that many to actually find, so that's cool. I do have a couple of complaints though. One is that the game doesn't seem to give you enough information sometimes. For instance, there's no real way to tell what all the status effects do. There isn't like an encyclopedia or anything. You'd have to like wiki it, I suppose. And some of the status effects are not that self-explanatory, so sometimes you don't really know what to do. Like, what does Inception do? what does sickness do? I figured maybe it was a damage over time, but it's not. And there are several status effects that seem to be kind of redundant, that seem to do the exact same thing, but because you don't really know the details on what they do, you can't actually say if that's the case or not. There seem to be several status effects that basically do the paralyzed thing of making them have a chance to lose their turn before they act, and there are like 4 of them that all do that, but the thing is I don't know if they're actually redundant since I don't know specifically what they do, if they each have a different activation time or if one of them tends to last longer than the other. You know, it's kind of hard to tell because that sort of information just isn't given to you. The other bit of information that isn't given to you is the stat up and down effects. That's a very common thing in games like this. You know, you'll have like an attack up or a special defense down, all those various abilities, buffs and debuffs that apply to you and your opponent's creatures. This game has those, but it doesn't tell you when they go off. So if your opponent uses a move that you've never seen before, and say it maybe like increases their defense, you won't necessarily know that because it won't tell you, and there won't be like a defense up effect, and you may get hit with something that has like an attack down effect and not actually know it because it won't show you that that effect has gone off. This is especially annoying when you're trying to use an ability that does something like that with like a 35% chance is usually the common number, so you don't actually know whether or not it's gone off because there is no effect that shows you those stats changing, which is kind of annoying. I think it would be nice if there could be just a simple like particle effect added or something that implies that these effects have gone off. It also doesn't tell you what the minigame for capturing is for. There's a sort of button pressing minigame when you go to catch a creature. Presumably this increases your chance of catching it, but since it doesn't tell you exactly what it does, it's hard to say. I assume that's what it does, but I don't know by how much. Like, is it worth doing? Is it like a 10% increase? Is it a 50% increase? You know, I have no idea. So some more information on some of the general things that happen during gameplay would be nice. The game's writing is actually pretty good. It's got a fair amount of character to it. The characters are fun to interact with, and the writing for the most part is nice, although I will say that it does sometimes rely a little bit too much on the whole we know we're an RPG, let's joke about video games thing, which I tend to find is usually really hit or miss, but that's more of a personal preference than like an objective problem with the game. And aside from the occasionally sort of heavy-handed video game reference joke, for the most part the writing is actually nice, and the story is worth following. It's actually pretty interesting. I like the world they've created, and the characters within it are fun to interact with. The game does have a rather nasty habit of springing some very tough fights on you quite suddenly. Especially in like the mid to later parts of the story, it's pretty common for you to have sometimes multiple really hard fights in a row, sometimes without the chance to rest, in which case if you lose you have to go back to the beginning fight even if there were like 2 really hard ones in a row. And that can get a little bit obnoxious at times because sometimes it feels like you have to grind a lot because some of the fights are a little difficult for the level that you're likely to be when you encounter them, especially when it seems like every step in the current story for an area is yet another really hard fight. But this is alleviated a little bit by the wealth of side quests and the fact that the world is quite open to exploration, so if you are having trouble with something, you don't necessarily have to feel that you need to just go outside and walk around in the grass for half an hour and grind. There's probably a lot of other places you could be going and doing other stuff. So I can't really complain too much about it being super grindy because the world is open and large enough to where it feels like there's always a fair amount to do and you never really have to repetitively grind just to pass the next story event so much. Although a map would be nice. The game world is actually quite large and has fairly complex connections in some areas that you'll need some abilities and things that you'll find later to go back to and complete, so a map marking some of these would be useful. Also, an escape rope-like item would be really useful, something that allows you to teleport yourself out of a dungeon or a dangerous area, because sometimes you may have a couple of really hard boss battles at the end of a story dungeon, and then have to walk all the way back out through even more battles and hope that you survive. So that's a little bit unfortunate. The ability to sort of get back to safety quickly if things go bad would be handy. But overall, I think it's a pretty well-polished and fun addition to the creature-catching RPG genre, and it does stand on its own. It doesn't necessarily have all of the polish and all of the expected quality of life features that we've come to know from games like Pokemon that have been running for a really long time, but as only the second effort from this small team, it's nice, and it does what it sets out to do pretty well. It's an enjoyable creature-capturing RPG, and if you're a fan of RPGs like this, then I'd say you'd be doing yourself a favor to check it out, because it is enjoyable enough to hold your attention with a fun story and some really enjoyable combat and some nice, pretty effects and everything that all sort of make it a not necessarily as well-polished package as you might hope for from like a big AAA game, but it isn't one of those, and for what it is, it's actually a pretty nice time. So that is Nexomon Extinction. The link will, as always, be in the description below this video to take you to the Steam page so you can check it out yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.